Did you know, during the 18th and 19th centuries, it was completely legal to possess a dead body? Today we are traveling back to an era of dubious law. From famous grave robberies to the reasons behind the crime, join me and Maya as we share our thoughts, feelings, and discoveries about the history of grave robbing. So hop into our morbid time machine and let's get into it. Welcome inquirers, new and old. Have you ever wanted to go down a rabbit hole of morbid history, but you don't know where to start?
Then you are in the right place. Our Grim Past is a podcast where each week we explore messed up history.
From shipwrecks and spooky places to morally questionable people and practices, we're Sophia
and Maia.
Join us in our morbid time machine
And let's discuss history's most fucked up.
Hey Maya!
Hi Sophia!
How are you today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. I'm so excited for this grave robbing episode.
Me too. I think grave robbing is so interesting. I don't know a ton about it, so I'm excited to learn more today.
Yeah.
For me, actually, my first big encounter with, grave robbing, when I kind of, feel like what I think of when I think of grave robbing, is actually Shakespeare's Hamlet.
Really?
Yes. So, I do like Shakespeare, and there's, in Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 1, is where you probably have heard, his speech, where he holds up the skull and he talks about the clown. Very famous thing. And that actually is about grave robbing in general. It's grave diggers. They're digging up Yorick's grave. He's a former jester that Hamlet knew. And they're digging it up to replace the body or just take it out of the graveyard because it's old enough for it's decomposed now. And he comes across it and he holds up the skull. And he has this crazy speech which causes him to confront his own mortality in inevitable death, regardless of his social status, which ties into the whole story of Hamlet. But I won't go too deep into that because that's not what we're talking about today. But then there's also, in addition to that, in Act 5, Scene 1, we see Ophelia's funeral procession because she's dead now, and her brother jumps into her grave and curses Hamlet and claims that Hamlet's the reason Ophelia died, which, if you read it, he kind of is. But then Hamlet comes out and he's like, I actually loved Ophelia. And everyone's like, okay, but you made her kill herself. And so it's just really interesting.
Yeah.
And that's just one thing that I think about for grave robbing, and I feel like a lot of our listeners might know of.
Yeah. This isn't really grave robbing related, but when you were talking about the decomposed body, did you know that the phrase, I wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole, comes from when people would be buried in safes and big mausoleums. You could only put one dead body in there a year because they're pretty small.
Yeah.
So they would wait for the body to decompose, and once it was decomposed, they'd have this giant 10-foot pole that they would scrape the remains to the side to put the next body in, to leave room for the next body. So it's oh, I wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole. I wouldn't even scrape your remains aside, which is when you think about it in that context, that is even sicker burn than you would originally think.
Isn't the 10-foot pole thing in that song about the Grinch?
Yes!
Oh my god. It's Santa's I don't even touch with a 10-foot pole.
Is it Santa who sings that, though?
I think it's supposed to be Santa.
Really?
Yeah, who's talking about Mr. Grinch?
Huh. I didn't know that. I thought it was just a random singer. It was just a Grinch song.
I thought it was supposed to be Santa.
Huh.
I don't know.
We'll figure that out.
Yeah. Episode about, Easter egg.
Christmas episode. Holiday episode. Maybe a little something with Krampus.
Ooh, we're giving you guys spoilers.
Ooh.
All right. Well, now we should probably get on to actually talking about today's topic.
Grave robbing.
True.
All right. I think it's probably important to first start off with there is a little bit of a distinction between grave robbing and body snatching. We will be covering both. But Maya, how about you take away?
All right. So for the differences between grave robbing and body snatching is generally just the removal of a body from a grave, whereas grave robbing refers to the actual robbery of a grave, so stealing the things like jewelry or clothing or anything else in it. But body snatching is literally just taking the body. And body snatching became a very common practice in 18th and 19th century, and it was mainly so that people could sell cadavers to academic institutions for anatomy practice. And some other fun things that I'll be talking about later later. We'll give a little Easter egg right now. It involves cannibalism, if that interests you.
Cannibalism.
Mm-hmm.
Can't wait.
Yeah. All right, take it away, Sophia.
All right, so I feel like it's important to figure out, why did people rob graves? Why was body snatching so prevalent?
True.
Honestly, prior to the passing of the Anatomy Act of 1832, the only way that medical schools could legally get cadavers was when criminals were sentenced to death and dissection.
Ooh.
Which, even though definitely a time where a lot of people got arrested for a lot of dumb things and sentenced to death for a lot of minute things, that still did not keep up with the need that medical schools needed for the cadavers.
What was the ratio of it? Like, how many bodies per medical student?
Generally, it was several thousand to one.
Wow.
Typically today, that ratio stays between like about 2 to 1. So 2 students to every 1 cadaver.
Wow.
But I mean, technically, legally, you could have a body, as I mentioned before. You could just possess a dead body. You just couldn't get caught stealing anything from the grave or get caught disturbing the grave. And then for the anatomists and surgeons, they could not get caught dissecting the stolen body. That's typically why a lot of grave robbers would brutally disfigure the faces of the stolen bodies so then they couldn't be identified.
Yikes.
Crazy.
So, what was the process of taking the body out of the grave, or how did they, like, actually seal it?
So, there were a couple different ways that people could do it. If the body was unclaimed, it was super easy. All the grave robbers had to do was go into the morgue, talk to the church and sextons or morticians and be like, hey, this is my relative. And then they'd be like, cool. And they'd be able to take the dead body with them and sell it to a medical school.
Fun.
Yeah. Security was not super high back then. But if the body was already claimed, grave robbers with financial means or anatomists or surgeons with financial means could actually bribe the church sextons or the undertakers into them giving the body, which was, again, depending on how much wealth the person had. So essentially, rich people could just buy the dead bodies.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. Love it.
Love money.
Well, yeah, money got you far back then.
Yeah.
But if the body was already in the ground, there was a little bit of a different method for that. So typically, the gangs of grave robbers would hire women spies to follow the mourning and the funeral procession to the graveyard, keep track of any traps or guards that were placed by the grave, see what's going on, report back to the grave robbers. Grave robbers would plan. Once it became dark out, they would go down to the graveyard. If there were any guards, they would either bribe them or get them drunk. Just kind of get them out of the way, but thankfully no murder involved with that. And then they would dismantle any traps that were set, memorize. A lot of times, people with less money, if they couldn't afford to make a trap, they would arrange stones or sticks. So the grave robbers would memorize the placement of those stones and sticks. So then they wouldn't get caught and the family members wouldn't realize someone stole our relative's body. We need to call the cops. Then they would dig up the head of the coffin, digging up the whole coffin. That took up a lot of energy. That's something you see in a lot of media when they're talking about grave robbing in a lot of TV and movies. It's, they dig up the whole coffin and then pick it up and then dismantle it. No, typically they would just dig up around the head of the coffin, kind of pry the top open, and kind of with the help of the weight of the dirt, the top of the coffin would snap off, leaving a hole that they could lift the body from the grave from, kind of resurrect, if you may. So once they had that hole, they would loop rope around, typically under the arms, so then they could just pull them up. As I stated before, they would disfigure the face, so then the person would be unrecognizable. cart them off to the local medical school or anatomist or highest bidder and sell the body. But no, grave robbing was a pretty profitable endeavor. Cadavers in Europe or in England would cost around £2 per adult body. Converted to US dollars with inflation, that's around $500 today. And that's just for one body. So if you're digging up 3, 4, 5 bodies every night, okay, you're making
bank.
You're making bank, exactly. Yeah. But
so earlier, Sophia, you also mentioned the Anatomy Act of 1832, and I was just wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, so the Anatomy Act allowed for any unclaimed bodies from workhouses, prisons, hospitals, stuff like that, to be delivered to the medical schools. Typically, families would have around 48 hours to claim their loved ones. And if the body wasn't claimed after that, they would be kind of carted off to the medical school, and medical school would get their bodies.
So this probably helped with, like, stopping the illegal.
Yes, that was one of the main reasons. That, and then embalming, they didn't have to get the body so fast.
Yeah.
So the body could be preserved for a little bit longer, but yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you have any, like, specific cases of grave robbing?
Yeah, I have a couple.
Okay.
I mean, one of my favorites, it isn't technically a grave robbing case.
Mm-hmm.
William Hare and William Burke were these British murderers who they realized, oh, we can make a lot of money by selling deceased bodies.
Yeah.
They were landlords and realized after one of their older residents had passed that, oh, we can make a lot of money from selling bodies. But they got a little bit bored of waiting around for residents to die.
Like you do.
So they started killing people, and they were some pretty big serial killers. They made quite a bit of money. They ended up getting caught trying to kill someone, and that dissolved and got rid of their entire plan. But that one is a really interesting story, and because of William Burke and William Hare, that actually sparked a lot of the discussion for the Anatomy Act. Another really interesting one is the case from the University of Iowa. In 1870, it opened up. They wanted to keep their prices pretty low, so they only charged for materials and then facilities management. But again, cadavers are expensive. And this was like when Iowa was still very, very new. So the cost to transport a cadaver to Iowa, that was around $25 to $30 back in 1870. Today, that would be closer to $600 to $720.
Wow.
But the other thing, too, is there was no refrigeration, so there was no guarantee that the cadaver that they would get would still be quality enough to dissect and to learn about that anatomy. So, they turned to grave robbing because body's a little bit closer to home. And it was definitely a little bit cheaper.
Yeah.
1870 in December, Mary Hare, a very well-known woman in the community, died. Shortly after her burial, her remains were exhumed by a janitor from the university. Allegedly, her remains were then sold to Dr. James Boucher, professor of anatomy at the university. However, the janitor did rescind that and claimed that Dr. Boucher was never involved when he testified. Obviously, the community was in outrage. This was a very well-known woman, and the fact that someone had the audacity to steal her body was a shock to everyone. The community then stormed the school trying to catch the students in the act of dissecting Herrick's body. Students were warned ahead of time of the search and took her body and hid her in a haystack outside of town. They then brought her back to the Undertaker with hopes of, since they brought her body back, maybe you won't press charges.
How'd that go?
Oh, it did not work. There were charges pressed against several faculty and students. However, none of them were ever brought to trial because no one who originally testified could be found. There's a lot of speculation of some money exchanging hands between the time of the initial investigation and when the trials came about.
Yeah.
Similarly, in Des Moines, Iowa, another professor, Dr. James Overton from Drake University, was arrested after getting caught stealing a body from Woodland Cemetery. The body was buried in the Potter's Field, which was very, very common for grave robbers to go after bodies who were in kind of more populated areas, more like kind of mass grave area, because, hey, then you can get way more bodies and you don't have to go through the hassle of breaking open a coffin and remembering everything. But that was in 1893. It was pretty insane couple of years for Iowa there.
Yeah. Iowa really just said grave robbing party.
Let's do it.
Ooh. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, there were definitely some deterrents that were used.
Mm-hmm.
We will have pictures on our Instagram, our Grim Past Podcast. Follow us on Instagram to see any pictures. But they had, mort safes. It was like a little cage that would go over the coffin. The crazy thing about that is, like, oftentimes they were so expensive that people would just rent them instead of buying them.
I mean, that makes sense because you only need it around for a certain amount of time until the body really isn't valid.
Exactly.
Or like body like snatching more so than grave robbing.
Exactly. But just like the fact that, oh yeah, like I'm just buying a used mort safe for my loved one.
Yeah, no, I'm just gonna go pick up a little grave cage.
Woo! Oh yeah, no, that was the one that was used by Aunt Becky back 5 years ago. Is a
family heirloom.
Exactly. The other really popular option was coffin collars. So that was typically a piece of metal that was attached around the neck of the deceased and then bolted to the bottom of the coffin.
Oh.
So then you literally could not remove the body without decapitating the body. And again, that's not very helpful to anatomists.
Yeah.
You mentioned cannibalism earlier. I'm intrigued.
I did. So, to get into this, we're going to talk a bit more about Egyptian grave robbing, which is mainly tomb robbing, which was actually considered a very serious crime in ancient Egypt, but it still actually was very, very rampant. And especially for kings who were buried like in the pyramids and stuff, they had a lot of riches in there and they all got stolen. Sometimes the bodies were able to survive, but not always. And in the 16th and 17th century, Europeans decided to have the wonderful idea of incorporating mummies into their medicine. The rich would be able to like buy a mummy and they'd get ground up and just put, like, apothecaries would put it in medicine, which is so crazy. But because it technically is cannibalism, but what is even more interesting is during this time, there was also like multiple instances of cannibalism and it was frowned upon greatly, but use of human bodies in medicine was normal.
So you could take it as your cough syrup, but you couldn't just gnaw on your neighbor for fun.
I mean, to each their own, but most people who had the money to like buy and eat mummies were like the royalty and rich. Also priests and many, many doctors would do this. Like, it was a very common practice and it was like, quote unquote, like proven by medicine.
I'm kind of surprised that that wasn't frowned upon by priests, because they seem like the type of people who like, Jesus would not like that.
Yeah, no, it was very, very common. But this is a little fun fact. But since poor people didn't have the money to buy these mummies, what ended up happening is actually, for a lot of the medicine, it was just human body parts were used. So fresh blood was also sometimes seen as being something that was good to use. And poor people didn't have the money to buy mummies. So when public executions would happen, if you were poor, you could just take a little stroll to your neighborhood public execution and buy a cup of hot blood to drink.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, doesn't sound too good, but...
No, to each their own.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so that actually reminds me of, so kind of going back to anatomists.
Mm-hmm.
So there were so few bodies for them to legally have, especially in England.
Yeah.
That they would fight at the gallows over the body. And there were quite a few instances where the deceased wasn't quite deceased yet. And sometimes they would wake up mid-dissection. Or the anatomists would be dissecting the body and realize, oh shit, there's still fresh blood that's pumping through this body. But at that point, it was too late. So they're like, cool, we just gotta continue. So even though the person was gonna be dead anyway, they suffered much worse of a fate than they initially would have. But sorry for my little tangent.
No, I loved it. But going back to mummies, I would like to make a little note more so of tomb robbing. As I mentioned before, it was heavily frowned upon. And tombs were actually built specifically to try and deter treasure hunters and grave robbers. Regardless, it obviously still happened. Like, the pyramids of Giza were, specifically built for those reasons. None of the treasures or kings that were buried there have been found. And all of the treasure was lost. But King Tut's was not lost. So his tomb remained, intact until it was found by Howard Carter. And this actually only happened because King Tut was accidentally buried in the wrong tomb. So from the source that I found, it said that he was accidentally buried by ancient workers who built the tomb of Ramesses IV nearby. And they kind of were just a little switched up. And it was built so well and just without a trace that it was preserved until the 20th century when Carter found it. And this is very important because it shows the type of wealth that was buried in tombs of those days. His tomb is estimated at around $750 million from the site that I found. But he was by far way less wealthy than a lot of other Egyptian kings who were buried before him. Yeah, so you can only just imagine all of the stuff that was in there that got looted over the years. So that's why it's just a very significant thing in Egyptian tomb robbing. It's kind of interesting to me because for Egyptians, if the audience doesn't know this, they placed a lot of importance on life after death, and they have a lot of respect for the dead. That's why they built tombs and stuff and surrounded them with so many things, because they believed that you could take those things with you, to the afterlife. It was something that you wanted to have. And for those to be robbed, it was obviously most Egyptians were incredibly angered by the fact that people were disturbing the final resting place of these people. But it's just it was such a common thing to respect the dead that grave robbing really shouldn't have been as big of a deal as it was. But I mean, with all that treasure in there, it's not really that surprising.
Yeah. Well, and another thing that I've noticed, especially while doing my research, was the difference between the outcomes of grave robbing in the global north versus the global south.
Yeah.
So typically in Europe and the United States, they would steal just the bodies, having not necessarily respect, but more fear of law enforcement of, oh, if we take anything else, then we're going to get in a lot of trouble. So we're just going to take the bodies. Whereas in Egypt, or I recently read about more recently in the Dakotas, a lot of Native American graves, they have been looted for the treasures. And it's, I don't know, that's just something that's really interesting to me of the difference in almost respect for the deceased.
Yeah. I mean, it's something to look into, I guess. Yeah. We're not going over it in this episode.
Yeah,
but
we are
it's just
running out of time.
an interesting topic for you guys to talk about with people you know.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. Join us next week where we will be talking about H.H. Holmes and his murder castle with guest speaker Cadence.
Ooh. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Thank you for joining us today. As always, all sources will be listed in the show notes below.
Be sure to subscribe so you won't miss out on our upcoming discussions. Join us next week as we delve into the intriguing depths of our grim past.
Stay curious. There's so much more to uncover.